Harold Gutierrez worked as a funeral director in Houston, Texas, for 42 years before he retired in 2015. He handled thousands of services, saw every kind of death, comforted families through unimaginable grief. But there's one case he won't forget, one exhumation in 1978 that changed how he approached every preparation, every viewing, every burial, the case of Rebecca Valdez. The woman who wasn't dead when they buried her. I met Harold at his home in Pearland in July 2024. He'd been reluctant to talk about this case for decades, but now, at 79 years old, he said he wanted the story documented. Wanted people to understand why modern death verification procedures exist, why funeral directors are trained to look for specific signs, why the protocols matter. We sat in his living room surrounded by family photos and certificates from his career, and he told me about the day they opened Rebecca Valdez's casket. It was August 1978. Harold said, his hands folded in his lap. Rebecca Valdez had died, or so everyone thought, on June 3rd of that year. She was 53 years old, housewife, mother of 4. She'd collapsed at home. Her husband called an ambulance. By the time they got to the hospital, the doctors pronounced her dead. Natural causes, they said, heart failure. Rebecca's funeral had been standard. Viewing at the funeral home, service at the church, burial at Forest Park Cemetery. Harold had handled the arrangements personally. He'd prepared the body, dressed her, applied makeup, positioned her in the casket. She looked peaceful, Harold said quietly. That's what everyone said. Like she was sleeping. The family was devastated, but they took comfort in that. She looked at peace. Rebecca was buried on June 6, 1978, 3 days after her death. Standard time frame. The funeral went smoothly. The family said their goodbyes. The casket was sealed and lowered into the ground. Then, 2 months later, I got a call from a lawyer. Harold said. Rebecca had a life insurance policy, a big one, $500,000, and the insurance company was contesting the claim. They wanted an exhumation, wanted an autopsy. They thought maybe Rebecca had died from something other than natural causes. Thought maybe there was fraud involved. The family had objected. Didn't want Rebecca disturbed. But the insurance company had legal grounds. A judge approved the exhumation order. Harold had been contacted to coordinate the process, supervise the disinterment, transport the casket, be present when it was opened. August 22nd, 1978, Harold said. I'll never forget that date. We arrived at the cemetery at 7 a.m. It was already hot. Texas summer. The ground crew had started digging at 6. By 8, they'd reached the vault. Harold had been there with the cemetery superintendent, 2 police officers, a medical examiner named Dr. Philip Martinez, and the lawyer representing the insurance company. Standard witnesses for an exhumation. We pulled the vault up, Harold said, opened it. The casket looked fine from the outside. No damage, no water intrusion. Everything sealed properly, but Dr. Martinez wanted to open it right there, at the graveside. Insurance company insisted. They wanted photographs, documentation, wanted to verify the body was Rebecca's before transporting it to the morgue. Harold had broken the casket seal, the same seal he'd secured 2.5 months earlier. He'd worked slowly, carefully. This was someone's mother, someone's wife. She deserved dignity, even in this process. I lifted the lid, Harold said, and I knew immediately something was wrong. The smell was the first indicator. Not the smell of normal decomposition, which Harold had experienced countless times. This was different, more pungent, more wrong. The casket interior looked disturbed. The satin lining was torn in places, wrinkled, bunched up. Then I saw Rebecca. Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. And she wasn't the way I'd positioned her. Not at all. Harold had placed Rebecca on her back, hands folded over her abdomen, legs straight. Standard positioning. But the body in the casket was twisted. Her right knee was bent upward. Her left arm was across her chest. Her right hand was near her face, and her face. Her face was turned to the side, mouth open, eyes partially open. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, Harold said. Looked at the body, looked at the casket interior, and his face went white. He said, "Everyone needs to see this. Document everything, photograph everything." The police photographer had moved in, started taking pictures from every angle, and that's when they all saw it clearly. The inside of the casket lid. The white satin lining was shredded, torn, and underneath, on the wood itself, were marks, deep gouges, scratches, 4 parallel lines, again and again, all over the interior of the lid. I started shaking, Harold said. I'd prepared bodies for 20 years at that point. I knew what those marks meant. I knew what had happened. But I didn't want to believe it. Dr. Martinez had examined the body more closely right there at the graveside, looked at the hands, the fingers, the fingernails. Several nails were torn, broken, ragged, and there were splitters, tiny fragments of wood and satin fibers embedded in what remained of the tissue on the fingertips. Dr. Martinez said it out loud. Harold said what we were all thinking. She was alive. When you buried her, she was alive. She woke up in this coffin and tried to get out. Harold had stepped back from the grave. The morning heat suddenly felt suffocating. The police officers were talking urgently into their radios. The lawyer was taking notes frantically. The cemetery superintendent was standing frozen, staring at the casket. I kept thinking about the funeral, Harold said, about how peaceful she'd looked, about how I'd checked for signs of life, checked for breathing, checked for pulse, checked for rigor mortis. She'd been checked at the hospital, pronounced dead by a doctor. How could this have happened? The medical examiner ordered immediate transport to the morgue. The casket was sealed again, loaded onto Harold's hearse. Harold had driven to the medical examiner's office with a police escort, trying to process what he'd seen. The full autopsy took 2 days, Harold said. Dr. Martinez called me personally to explain the findings. He wanted me to understand, wanted me to know this wasn't my fault. But I still felt responsible. Rebecca Valdez had suffered what's called a cataleptic seizure, a rare condition where the body enters a state that mimics death. Breathing becomes undetectable. The heart rate drops so low it can't be measured with standard equipment. The body temperature drops. Muscles become rigid. To all observable signs, the person appears dead. In 1978, we didn't have the advanced monitoring equipment we have now, Harold said. No EEG machines to measure brain activity. No sophisticated methods to confirm cardiac death. Doctors relied on observation, stethoscope, pulse check, visual examination, and in Rebecca's case, all those signs indicated death. But Rebecca hadn't been dead. She'd been in a deep coma, a cataleptic state that mimicked death so completely that even the hospital staff had been fooled. And at some point after burial, Dr. Martinez estimated within 6 to 12 hours she'd woken up. The autopsy showed cause of death as asphyxiation, Harold said. She'd suffocated, run out of oxygen in the sealed casket. But the positioning of the body, the condition of the hands, the scratch marks, all of it indicated she'd been conscious, aware, trying desperately to get out. Dr. Martinez had estimated Rebecca had been alive and conscious in that casket for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours before the oxygen ran out. 30 minutes to 2 hours of scratching, clawing, screaming in darkness, knowing she was buried alive, knowing no one could hear her. The police investigated, Harold said, investigated the hospital, the attending physician, me, the funeral home, looking for negligence, looking for someone to blame. But Dr. Martinez testified that this was a medical phenomenon, extremely rare, that the cataleptic state had fooled everyone, that by 1978 standards of practice, all proper procedures had been followed. The case never went to trial. The insurance company paid the claim. The family, devastated by the revelation of how Rebecca had actually died, settled quietly. The hospital updated its protocols, and Harold Gutierrez changed everything about how he approached his work. I started doing additional checks, Harold said. Things that weren't standard at the time. I'd wait longer before preparing bodies. Watch for any signs of breathing, any movement. I installed a mirror system, would hold a mirror under the nose, watch for condensation. I'd check body temperature multiple times, check for lever mortis, the settling of blood that only happens after true death. Harold had also advocated for changes in Texas funeral industry regulations, pushed for mandatory wait times between death pronouncement and preparation, pushed for additional verification protocols. Some of his suggestions were adopted, others weren't. The funeral industry changed a lot after cases like Rebecca's became known, Harold said. Modern embalming procedures include verification steps. Hospitals have better monitoring equipment. Death has to be confirmed with more rigorous testing. But in 1978, we were still relying on methods from the 19th century. Harold had kept the photographs from Rebecca's exhumation, not officially. Those were evidence were sealed after the investigation, but he'd made copies, kept them in a locked file in his office for his entire career. Sometimes when he was preparing a body, when he had any doubt at all, he'd look at those photographs, remind himself what could happen if he missed something. I showed those photos to every apprentice who worked for me, Harold said. Not to scare them, to educate them, to make sure they understood that our job isn't just making bodies look nice for viewing. Our job is making absolutely certain that the person we're preparing is actually dead, because if we fail at that, the consequences are unimaginable. Harold had tried to contact Rebecca's family years later, wanted to apologize, to explain, to offer whatever comfort he could. They'd refused to meet with him. He understood. How do you face the man who buried your mother alive, even if it wasn't his fault? I think about Rebecca often, Harold said, especially at night. I think about those 30 minutes, those 2 hours, what she must have thought, what she must have felt. Waking up in nakedness, in a confined space, realizing where she was. The panic, the terror, scratching at the lid until her fingernails broke, screaming until the air ran out. He pulled out a folder, opened it carefully. Inside were photocopied documents, the original autopsy report, the exhumation order, and photographs. Black and white, grainy, but clear enough. The shredded satin lining, the scratched wood, the twisted body, the broken fingernails. This is why protocols matter, Harold said. This is why we have regulations. This is why funeral directors spend years in training. Because this, he gestured to the photographs, this can never happen again, should never happen again. But it did happen. To Rebecca Valdez, in Houston, Texas. And I was there. Harold closed the folder, put it back in his desk drawer. At 79, he'd been retired for 9 years. But he still woke up sometimes, thinking about that August morning, about opening that casket, about seeing those scratch marks. "You want to know what I believe?" Harold said. "I believe catalepsy is more common than we know. I believe there are probably people throughout history who were buried alive, who woke up in coffins, who died the way Rebecca died, and we'll never know, because most of them were never exhumed." He walked me to the door. Outside, the Texas heat was oppressive, normal, alive. "Modern medicine has gotten better," Harold said. "We have EEGs, we have cardiac monitors, we have brain death protocols, but we're still human. We still make mistakes. And that's why I tell this story. Because complacency kills. Because assuming someone is dead isn't enough. Because we have to check. And check again. And be absolutely certain." Harold Gutierrez closed the door, and I walked to my car thinking about Rebecca Valdez, about a woman who woke up in a coffin, who clawed at the lid until her fingernails broke, who died underground, alone, in darkness, buried alive because of a rare medical condition that fooled everyone. The rational part of me knows this was a tragedy, a medical phenomenon, a failure of 1970s diagnostic capabilities. Not malice, not negligence, just the limitations of what was possible to detect at the time. But I can't stop thinking about those scratch marks, about 4 parallel lines gouged into wood, about broken fingernails, about a body that shifted position, knees bent, hands twisted, because she'd been moving, fighting, trying to survive. Maybe Rebecca Valdez is the reason modern death protocols are so rigorous. Maybe her death, her real death, her second death, her death by suffocation in a sealed casket, saved countless others. Maybe every time a doctor waits an extra hour before pronouncing death, every time a funeral director does one more check, every time someone looks twice at a body that seems too lifelike, Rebecca's legacy is there, a reminder that death must be certain, that being mostly dead isn't enough, that the difference between life and death is sometimes so subtle that only time and technology can reveal it, and that the worst nightmare, waking up in your own coffin, isn't just a horror story. Sometimes it's real, and when it is, the evidence is written on the inside of the casket lid, in scratch marks, in broken nails, in the desperate final moments of someone who died twice. Once when everyone thought she was dead, and once when she actually was. Antoine Broussard worked cemetery maintenance in New Orleans, Louisiana for 8 years before the day in September 2017 when he opened the Rousseau family crypt and heard it scream. He'd worked in some of the oldest above-ground cemeteries in America, had opened hundreds of crypts and vaults, had seen the expected decay and disarray that comes with a century and a half of burial. But he'd never heard the dead scream before, never seen bones arranged in ways that defied explanation. He quit that night. Never went back. Never worked cemetery maintenance again. I met Antoine at a café in the French Quarter in March 2024. He'd moved to Baton Rouge after leaving cemetery work, now drove trucks for a shipping company. He'd been hesitant to talk about what happened, said he'd spent years trying to forget, but over chicory, coffee and beignets he barely touched. He told me about the Rousseau crypt, about the sound that came from inside, about what they found when they looked. New Orleans cemeteries are different, Antoine said, his hands wrapped tight around his coffee cup. We bury above ground. Water tables too high for traditional graves, so we have these crypts, stone buildings, family tombs, some of them dating back to the 70s. And when a family dies out, when there's no one left to maintain them, those crypts just sit, sealed, waiting. Antoine had worked for the Historic Cemetery Preservation Society. His job was maintenance, restoration, sometimes relocation. When old crypts were in danger of collapse, when families requested remains moved to new locations, Antoine's crew would open them, document the contents, carefully transfer the remains. The Rousseau crypt was in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, Antoine said. Built in 1847, the family was prominent, Creole, wealthy, owned plantations outside the city. But the last Rousseau died in 1921. For 96 years that crypt had been sealed. No one maintaining it, no one visiting, just sitting there slowly deteriorating. September 14, 2017, Antoine's crew had been contracted to relocate the Rousseau remains. A distant relative, some fifth cousin who'd done genealogy research, had purchased a modern plot and wanted the family consolidated. Legal papers were in order. The Preservation Society had approved the work. There were 4 of us, Antoine said. Me, my supervisor Luis Delgado, and 2 other workers, Jerome Washington and Carlos Mendez. We'd done this kind of work before. Opened old crypts, moved remains. It was delicate work, respectful work, but it was routine. The Rousseau crypt was typical construction. Brick and plaster, about 8 feet wide by 12 feet deep. A heavy iron door with an ornate lock. No windows. The kind of structure designed to last centuries. But time and New Orleans humidity had taken their toll. The plaster was crumbling. The brickwork was compromised. Water damage was evident. We arrived around 8 a.m., Antoine said. September in New Orleans. Already 80 degrees. Humid. The kind of weather that makes everything stick to your skin. We set up our equipment, portable lights, documentation cameras, protective gear. Standard procedure. Louis had taken photographs of the exterior first. Documented the condition of the crypt before they touched anything. Then they'd approached the door. The lock was rusted solid. They'd had to cut it with bolt cutters. I remember putting my hand on that door, Antoine said quietly. It was cold, which was strange because everything else in the cemetery was hot. The tombs, the ground, the air, everything was hot. But that door was cold, like touching ice. They'd pulled the door open slowly. The hinges screamed, rusted metal grinding against stone. But that was normal. Expected. What wasn't normal was what happened next. The seal broke, Antoine said. You could hear it, that pop when pressure equalizes. And then this sound came out. This scream, high-pitched, loud. Like something was dying inside that crypt. Like something was being released. All 4 men had stepped back. The scream lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then stopped abruptly. Silence. Antoine had looked at Luis. Luis had looked at Jerome and Carlos. Nobody spoke. They all stood there staring at the open doorway, at the darkness inside. Luis said it was just air, Antoine said. Said when crypts are sealed for decades, air pressure builds up. When you break the seal, the air escapes fast through small openings. Makes sounds. Screams, whistles, groans. It's physics. It's not supernatural. Antoine had heard this before, understood the science. But the sound hadn't been like air whistling through a gap. It had been too human, too anguished, too much like an actual scream. We put on our respirators, Antoine said. Standard procedure. Old crypts can have dangerous gases. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, stuff that'll kill you if you breathe it. We waited 10 minutes for the air to clear. Then Luis and I went inside first. The interior of the Rousseau crypt was a single chamber. Stone shelves lined both walls, 6 shelves total, designed to hold coffins. Portable lights illuminated the space. And what Antoine saw made his blood run cold. The coffins were destroyed, Antoine said. Not decayed. Destroyed. Shattered. Wood fragments everywhere, casket hardware handles, hinges scattered on the floor, and the bones all over. Skulls, ribs, femurs, not organized, not lying where coffins would have been. Just like someone had taken the coffins and thrown them against the walls. Antoine had done dozens of historic exhumations, seen coffins that had collapsed from age, wood that had rotted away, bones that had tumbled when supports failed. That was normal, expected. But this was different. The distribution pattern was wrong, too chaotic, too violent. Louis was cataloguing, Antoine said, counting skulls, trying to identify how many bodies we were dealing with. The record said 9 Rousseaus were entombed here, adults and children. Louis counted 10 skulls. 10. Someone extra was in there. They'd photographed everything, documented the chaos. And that's when Antoine saw it. The thing that made him understand this wasn't normal decay or structural collapse. There was a child's coffin, Antoine said. Smaller than the others. It was on the lowest shelf, mostly intact. The wood was rotted, but the shape was still there. You could see it had been a child's casket, maybe 3 feet long, for an infant or toddler. And on top of that casket, placed carefully, deliberately, was a skull. An adult skull, not a child's. Positioned face down, looking at the small coffin below. The placement was too precise to be accidental, too intentional to be the result of decay or collapse. I said to Louise, "How did that get there?" Antoine said. And Louise just stared at it, shook his head, said, "I don't know. That shouldn't be possible. The physics didn't work. If the adult coffins above had collapsed, bones would have fallen straight down, scattered, not placed neatly on top of a lower coffin, and that skull wasn't resting naturally. It was positioned, deliberately turned to look down at the child's casket. Jerome and Carlos came in," Antoine said, "saw what we were seeing. Carlos made the sign of the cross. Jerome said we should leave, said this wasn't right, said we should seal it back up and walk away. But Louis had responsibilities, contracts, legal obligations. He'd called the Preservation Society director, explained the situation. The director had instructed them to continue, document everything, photograph everything, complete the relocation. We worked for 3 more hours, Antoine said, carefully collecting bones, identifying what we could. The Preservation Society had brought in a forensic anthropologist, a woman named Dr. Sharon LeBlanc. She examined everything on site, tried to make sense of what we'd found. Dr. LeBlanc had confirmed the chaos, said the pattern of bone distribution was inconsistent with natural decay or structural failure, said it looked like the interior of the crypt had been disturbed. But disturbed by what? The crypt had been sealed for 96 years. The door had been intact, no signs of break-in, no way for anyone to enter. Dr. LeBlanc examined the skull on the child's coffin. Antoine said, "Adult male," she determined. Middle-aged. And she found something else. The skull had damage, fractures, the kind that happen from impact, from being hit. She said the injuries were perimortem, around the time of death. Said this man had died violently. Antoine had looked through the burial records, the Rousseau family history, found that one of the people entombed in that crypt was André Rousseau, died 1889, age 42. The death certificate listed cause as accidental fall, but there were newspaper articles from the time, rumors, whispers of domestic violence, of a man who'd beaten his wife, who'd been cruel to his children. Henry's wife was buried there too, Antoine said. Marie Rousseau, died 1885, age 36. 4 years before Henri, The records said she died of pneumonia, but she'd been hospitalized multiple times before that. Broken bones, injuries consistent with abuse. And the child's coffin? That belonged to their daughter, Amélie Rousseau, died 1883, age 2. Cause of death listed as failure to thrive, a Victorian-era term that could mean anything from malnutrition to neglect. I stood in that crypt, Antoine said, looking at that skull positioned over that tiny coffin, and I thought, what if Henry did this? What if he killed his daughter, beat his wife, and when they were all buried together, when the family sealed them in, something happened, something moved that skull, put it there, made him face what he'd done. Dr. Leblanc had no explanation for the placement. Said that without evidence of human entry, without disturbance to the seal, she couldn't account for how bones had been rearranged. She documented everything. Recommended the remains be separated. Henry Rousseau buried apart from his wife and child in the new plot. We finished the relocation that afternoon, Antoine said. Packed everything up, transported the remains. But I couldn't shake it. Couldn't stop thinking about that scream when we opened the door, about those shattered coffin, about that skull placed so carefully, so deliberately, looking down at a child's grave. Antoine had gone home that evening, showered, tried to eat, but his hands were shaking. He kept seeing that skull, kept hearing that scream. Around 8 p.m., he'd called Louis, told him he was done, couldn't do this work anymore. Louis had tried to talk him out of it, said it was just a weird situation, said they'd seen strange things before. But we hadn't, Antoine said. Not like this. I'd seen decay, I'd seen bones, I'd seen coffins collapse. But I'd never seen bones arranged with intention. I'd seen evidence that the dead could move, could act, could place a skull exactly where it needed to be. Antoine had quit that night. Never went back to the cemetery, never finished out his notice. The Preservation Society mailed him his final paycheck. He'd moved to Baton Rouge within a month, started driving trucks. Normal work, predictable work, work that didn't involve opening crypts and finding the impossible. I talked to Dr. Leblanc later, Antoine said. Maybe 6 months after. Called her out of curiosity. Asked if she'd figured anything out. She said no, said it remained unexplained. Said that in 30 years of forensic anthropology she'd never seen anything like it, and she'd examined hundreds of historical burial sites. Dr. Leblanc had told Antoine something else, something she couldn't put in her official report. She said that in her professional opinion the bones in that crypt had been moved recently. Not a century ago when the last burial happened. Recently, within the past 10 or 20 years, the dust patterns, the way bones were positioned over other remains, all of it suggested recent disturbance. But the seal was intact, Antoine said. We documented that. The door hadn't been opened. The walls showed no signs of entry. So how does something move bones inside a sealed crypt? Antoine had researched Henri Rousseau after that. Found everything he could. Court records from the 1880s, newspaper articles, letters written by neighbors. A picture emerged of a violent man, a man who'd terrorized his family, who'd possibly caused the deaths of his wife and daughter, who'd been buried in the same crypt with them, because that's what families did in the 19th century. They stayed together, even in death. I think about that skull a lot, Antoine said, about it resting on Amélie's coffin, face down, looking at her, and I think, what if the dead have agency we don't want? What if they can move, can act, can create tableaus that tell stories, can position themselves to show us what happened, to testify? He finished his coffee, cold now. Outside, French Quarter tourists walked past. Normal life, normal New Orleans. The living city built on top of cities of the dead. You want to know what I believe? Antoine said. I believe that Scream was real. Not air escaping. Real. Something in that crypt screamed when we broke the seal. Screamed because it had been waiting. Waiting for someone to see, to witness, to understand. Antoine stood up, prepared to leave. And I believe Henri Rousseau's skull was placed on his daughter's coffin as evidence, Antoine said. Evidence of what he did. Evidence that couldn't be hidden, that the dead wouldn't allow to be hidden, because maybe the dead can't speak, can't testify in court, can't point fingers, but they can move bones, can arrange remains, can create scenes that ask questions we can't ignore. Antoine Broussard left the cafe that afternoon, heading back to Baton Rouge, back to his truck driving job where the strangest thing he'd encounter was traffic or bad weather. And I sat there thinking about the Rousseau crypt, about a scream that came from darkness, about shattered coffins and bones scattered with impossible intention, about a skull positioned over a child's grave. The rational explanation is physics and decay, air pressure released, structural failure, bones falling randomly and appearing intentional through coincidence. Dr. Leblanc's assessment of recent disturbance, explained by she doesn't know what. But Antoine heard that scream, felt that cold door, saw that skull positioned with such precision that 4 experienced workers all knew it wasn't accidental. Maybe the Rousseau crypt held more than bones. Maybe it held testimony, evidence. Story told by the dead because the living never asked the right questions in 1883 Maybe Henri Rousseau's skull was moved by something, someone who wanted us to see him looking down at what he destroyed, at the daughter he killed, at the guilt he couldn't escape. Not even after a century in a sealed crypt. Because death might seal your body in stone, but it doesn't seal your crimes, doesn't hide what you did. And sometimes the dead find ways to tell the truth, even if it takes even if it requires moving bones in a locked crypt, even if it means screaming when someone finally opens the door, because silence protects the guilty and the dead. Maybe the dead are tired of being silent.